The war had burned for so long that even the stars seemed dimmed by its fury. Across the Orion Cygnus arm, fleets clashed in the void, planets were turned to cinders, and civilizations that had once thrived were now nothing more than ruins drifting through space. The conflict between the Zeldar Dominion and the Zorvani Alliance had reached a grim equilibrium, one of mutual devastation, where neither side could deliver the killing blow, yet neither could afford to retreat. For the Zeldar, the war was a matter of dominion, a species bred for conquest. They had risen from the harsh deserts of Zelkar, their towering forms covered in dark, chitinous armor that had once shielded them from their own planet's ruthless predators. To them, all other species were lesser beings, existing only to serve or to be eradicated. Their war machine was vast and unrelenting, guided by the iron will of High Warlord Cordith, whose cold pragmatism had ensured the Dominion's survival for over a century. The Zorvani, by contrast, had never been conquerors. A coalition of species bound together by necessity, they had formed the alliance not out of ambition, but out of desperation. When the Zeldar had first emerged from the depths of space, burning entire systems in their wake, the Zorvani had fought not for power, but for survival. Their fleets were composed of dozens of species, each bringing their own strengths to the battlefield. Yet it was this very diversity that made them weak. Internal disagreements, conflicting doctrines, and logistical nightmares plagued them. Despite their best efforts, they were losing. The war had reached a turning point. The Zeldar had pressed the Alliance to the edge of annihilation, their forces pushing ever deeper into the last Zorvani strongholds. Defeat was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. It was in this moment of despair that the Zorvani began to consider what had once been unthinkable, seeking help from a species that had, until now, remained isolated, primitive by galactic standards. Admiral Kaler of the Zorvani High Command stood aboard the bridge of the flagship Vorthan's Resolve, staring at the strategic map that detailed the war's bleak reality. His species, the Vorthri, had once been explorers, their sleek, golden-hued vessels gliding through the void in pursuit of knowledge. Now, those same ships were scarred and battle-worn, their hulls covered in the blackened marks of Zeldar weaponry. Kaler himself, once a scholar, had long since abandoned any notion of peace. Behind him, the towering form of General Ormek loomed, his reptilian scales shimmering under the cold blue light of the command center. The Sorek were among the finest warriors in the Alliance, their brute strength making them ideal shock troops. Yet even they had begun to falter under the weight of the war. "We cannot hold much longer," Ormek rumbled, his voice a low growl. "Even if we rally at the Droska line, the Zeldar will overwhelm us. We need something different." Kaler exhaled slowly. He knew where this conversation was going. The same thought had haunted him for weeks now. "There is one species we have not yet brought into the war," he admitted. "They are unconventional, but they may be our only hope." Ormek narrowed his eyes. "You speak of the humans." Kaler nodded. The word itself felt strange on his tongue. Humanity, a race of bipeds dwelling on a single planet, one that had only just begun to stretch its reach into the stars. Compared to the Dominion, compared to the Zorvani, they were insignificant, but something about them unsettled him. "They are unpredictable," Kaler continued. "Their history is one of constant conflict, wars fought not for survival, but for ideology, for ambition, for vengeance. They are a species that has never known true peace, and yet they thrive." Ormek grunted. "And they have never faced an enemy like the Zeldar." "No," Kaler agreed, "but I suspect the Zeldar have never faced an enemy like them, either." The decision was made. A delegation was dispatched to the Sol system, moving in secret, careful to avoid Zeldar patrols. The humans had not yet been introduced to the wider galactic stage, their presence unknown to the Dominion, and it was crucial that they remain so, at least until their decision was made. The journey took weeks, the delegation crossing vast stretches of war-torn space before finally arriving at the edge of humanity's domain. What they found was unexpected. Humanity, it seemed, was far from primitive. In the span of mere centuries, a blink of an eye in galactic terms, they had mastered spaceflight, colonized nearby worlds, and built weapons that rivaled those of the oldest interstellar civilizations. Their world was divided, yet they possessed a ruthlessness in war that few species could match. And unlike the Zorvani, they did not fight with hesitation. The first meetings were tense. Humanity's leaders were wary, their diplomats sharp-eyed and shrewd. They listened as the Zorvani explained their plight, as Kaler laid out the grim future that awaited not just his people, but all who opposed the Zeldar. And then, at last, came the question that had haunted Kaler since the beginning. "Why should we fight your war?" the human representative asked. "Your conflict is not ours. Your enemy is not ours." Kaler had anticipated this. He had studied human history, their wars, their politics. He knew the answer they sought, because if the Zeldar win, they will not stop. One day, they will reach your world. And when they do, they will not offer you diplomacy. They will not offer you mercy. They will offer you only extinction. Silence hung between them. Then, slowly, the human leaned forward. "Then perhaps," he said, "it's time we show them what happens when they start a war they cannot win." A chill ran down Kaler's spine. The war had been long. The Zorvani had fought with desperation. The Zeldar had fought with cruelty. But humanity would fight with something far worse. They would fight to win. The first human warships arrived in silence, slipping into the war-torn sectors of space like shadows cast against the void. Their vessels were unlike anything the galaxy had seen before, smaller than the towering dreadnoughts of the Zeldar, yet dense with technology that defied conventional warfare. Matte black hulls absorbed sensor signals, while their weaponry bristled with an efficiency that suggested war was not just an art to them, but an obsession. Admiral Kaler stood aboard the Vorthan's Resolve, watching the human fleet take position. He had studied their ships, their tactics, their history, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer presence they exuded. He turned to the man standing beside him, a figure clad in dark gray armor, his expression unreadable beneath the visor of his helmet. "You're certain this is enough?" Kaler asked, his voice betraying the faintest trace of doubt. Colonel Elias Voss of the Terran Expeditionary Forces didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the battlefield ahead, where the Zeldar fleet loomed in the distance. At last he spoke, his voice steady, controlled. "They won't know what hit them." Kaler wished he could share the man's certainty. The Zeldar fleet was formidable. 20 war cruisers, flanked by a dozen carriers bristling with fighter craft. This sector, once a thriving trade hub, had been reduced to a graveyard of shattered hulls and drifting wreckage. The Zorvani had lost system after system here, retreating deeper into their dwindling territory. This would be humanity's first true test against the Dominion, and Kaler wasn't sure what frightened him more, the possibility that the humans might fail or the possibility that they wouldn't. A pulse of light flickered across the battlefield as the Zeldar fleet advanced. They moved with brutal precision, their formations disciplined, honed by centuries of conquest. Their leader, Commander Torkith, had no reason to believe this battle would be any different from the others. His fleet had crushed the Zorvani time and again, and these new arrivals, these humans, were just another obstacle to be swept aside. A transmission crackled through the command deck. "All units, weapons free." The human fleet ignited. There was no grand opening salvo, no warning shots. In an instant, the battlefield transformed. The humans did not engage in the slow, methodical exchanges that the Zorvani had favored. They struck like predators, their vessels darting through space with impossible agility. Railguns spat slugs at near-relativistic speeds, shredding through Zeldar shields before they could even react. Missile swarms erupted from hidden compartments, spiraling unpredictably through the void before slamming into enemy hulls with devastating precision. Electromagnetic pulses rippled across the battlefield, disrupting targeting systems and scrambling communications. Kaler watched in stunned silence as the first Zeldar war cruiser buckled under the onslaught, its shields collapsing in a burst of blue fire before its hull split apart in a chain reaction of detonations. Another followed, then another. The Zeldar fought back, their plasma lances searing through the void, but the humans didn't fight fair. They weaved through incoming fire, their ships altering course with a fluidity that defied expectation. Every maneuver was calculated, every shot placed with ruthless efficiency. On the bridge of his command ship, Torkut bared his fangs in frustration. This was not how battles were fought. There was an order to war, a rhythm. The Zorvani had always followed it, even in their defiance. But the humans they fought as if the battlefield were an extension of their own minds, as if they had already anticipated every move he would make. "Regroup," he barked. "Focus fire on their largest vessels." But before his orders could even take effect, the humans changed the rules again. A squadron of Terran gunships, barely more than slivers of metal against the backdrop of space, slipped past the main battle line, undetected until it was too late. They dove into the heart of the Zeldar formation, weaving between massive cruisers before releasing their payloads. Coordinated strikes that bypassed shields and targeted weak points with mathematical precision. In seconds, the Zeldar formation unraveled. Panic rippled through their ranks. And then the ground assault began. The humans didn't waste time with drawn-out planetary sieges. They deployed in rapid insertion pods, metal coffins that streaked through the atmosphere before slamming into the surface like meteor strikes. The Zeldar, accustomed to prolonged battles, barely had time to react before human soldiers burst from their landing sites, moving with terrifying efficiency. Colonel Voss led the charge, his combat armor absorbing the residual heat of re-entry as he emerged into the ruins of an old Zorvani colony. The Zeldar defenders, still scrambling to form a defensive line, were already too late. The humans fought with an intensity that defied reason. They did not march in rigid formations, nor did they engage in predictable exchanges of fire. They moved like ghosts, shifting between cover, using the very terrain against their enemies. Every shot was precise, every motion calculated. Where the Zorvani had relied on numbers and technology, the humans relied on adaptability, on an instinct for war honed through millennia of conflict. Voss's rifle kicked against his shoulder as he fired, dropping a Zeldar warrior with a clean shot to the throat. Around him, his soldiers moved in perfect coordination, their HUDs feeding them real-time data, marking enemy positions before they even emerged. It was less a battle and more an execution. He advanced, stepping over the bodies of fallen Zeldar, his expression unreadable behind his visor. Somewhere deep in his gut, he felt the familiar sensation he had known since his first deployment on Earth, the cold certainty of victory. Within hours, the Zeldar defenses collapsed. Within a day, the planet was theirs. Back aboard the Vorthan's Resolve, Kaler watched the battle's aftermath in stunned silence. He had known the humans were dangerous. He had expected them to be skilled. But this was something else entirely. He turned to Voss, who had returned to the command deck, his armor still dusted with the remnants of battle. The human met his gaze without hesitation, his expression calm, composed, as if the slaughter he had just orchestrated was nothing more than another day's work. "They never had a chance," Kaler murmured. Voss didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded. "They never do." The Zeldar were not accustomed to fear. For centuries, they had been the dominant force in the galaxy, carving their empire into the stars with fire and blood. Their enemies had always fallen in predictable patterns, first with defiance, then with desperation, and finally with surrender. But now, for the first time in living memory, the Dominion faced an opponent they could neither understand nor control. The humans had entered the war, and with them came something far more dangerous than superior firepower. They brought the art of psychological warfare. From the moment humanity's first offensive shattered the Zeldar's frontline forces, the war began to change. It wasn't just the losses, though those were staggering. It was the way the humans fought. They didn't simply destroy fleets. They dismantled them. They didn't just kill soldiers. They broke armies. The Zeldar had always relied on their sheer overwhelming force, on the certainty that no enemy could stand against them for long. But humanity did not meet them in open battle. Instead, they struck where the Dominion was weakest, severing supply lines, disrupting communications, spreading misinformation. Entire fleets vanished into the void without a trace. The Zeldar's battle algorithms, once infallible, became liabilities as humans exploited the Dominion's rigid tactics, forcing them into costly mistakes. Battles that should have been victories turned into humiliating routs, not because of brute force, but because the humans knew what the Zeldar would do before they even did it. High Warlord Cordith stood in the war chamber aboard the Dominion's flagship, Vorik's Wrath, his claws digging into the polished obsidian table as he studied the latest battle reports. Another fleet lost. Another fortress world overrun. The numbers were impossible. No species adapted this quickly. No species learned war with such terrifying speed. This is no longer a war, Cordith growled, his voice cold and measured. This is a hunt. His advisors stood in uneasy silence. None dared to speak the truth aloud. The hunters had become the prey. The humans had begun broadcasting intercepted Zeldar transmissions back to the Dominion's forces, messages filled with fear, confusion, and dying screams. Entire battalions had broken ranks simply from hearing their comrades beg for help before falling silent forever. And then there were the stories. Soldiers whispered of invisible killers that moved like shadows. Zeldar commanders abandoned their posts after seeing their entire fleets destroyed without a single human casualty. A name spread through the Dominion like a plague, a curse spoken only in hushed voices: the demons of Earth. Cordith refused to believe in ghosts. He knew there was a pattern, a strategy beneath the chaos. But that only made it worse. How do they know our movements before we make them? One of his generals demanded, his mandibles clicking in frustration. How do they always strike where we are weakest? Cordith's second-in-command, a battle-scarred warrior named Vorik, stepped forward, his deep-set eyes filled with cold calculation. We assumed the humans were reckless, that their unpredictability was a weakness. He turned to the warlord. But what if that was a deception all along? Cordith's eyes narrowed. Vorik continued, his voice grim. They are not erratic. They are precise. They are studying us, mapping our patterns, predicting our every move before we make it. He hesitated, then spoke the words none of them wished to say. They know us better than we know ourselves. A heavy silence settled over the chamber. Cordith clenched his jaw, his mind racing through possibilities. There was still one option, a final, desperate measure. Summon the Omega Legion, he ordered, his voice like stone, and prepare the Devourer Protocol. Across the stars, deep in the heart of the Dominion, a terrible weapon stirred. The Devourer Protocol, a superweapon designed to consume entire star systems, reducing them to lifeless voids, had never been used before. Even the Zeldar had deemed it too monstrous, too final. But now, as the specter of human victory loomed over them, Cordith saw no alternative. If they could not defeat the humans in battle, they would erase them from existence. But once again, the humans were ahead of them. By the time the Devourer fleet began its advance, humanity had already infiltrated its command structure. Their cyber warfare divisions had spent weeks planting false data, rerouting fleet orders, feeding misinformation directly into the Dominion's war network. Entire armadas were sent to fight battles that no longer existed. Supply chains collapsed. Coordinated offensives turned into disorganized retreats. And then, in a single decisive stroke, the humans struck at the heart of the Dominion's war effort. A small, elite strike force led by Colonel Elias Voss infiltrated the facility, housing the Devourer Protocol's control systems. The Zeldar had expected a massive fleet engagement, a desperate last stand. Instead, they got a surgical operation executed with terrifying precision. Voss and his soldiers moved like phantoms through the facility, neutralizing security systems, dismantling defenses, cutting through Zeldar guards before they even knew they were under attack. By the time Cordith received word of the infiltration, it was already too late. The Devourer fleet, his last best hope, was gone, its command structure crippled, its weapons systems disabled. The war had not just turned against him. It had ended before he even knew it had begun. Standing amidst the wreckage of his empire, Cordith finally understood. The humans had never fought this war on the same battlefield. While the Zeldar had sought victory through strength, humanity had sought it through understanding. They had not simply fought the Dominion. They had dissected it piece by piece, stripping it of its advantages, turning its own might against itself. Cordith exhaled slowly, his hands curling into fists. He had led his people through centuries of war, had crushed entire civilizations beneath his boot, had stood unchallenged at the peak of galactic power. And now, in the face of these strange, relentless creatures from a single insignificant world, he felt something he had never known before. Defeat. Far away, aboard the Vorthen's Resolve, Kaler stood alongside Colonel Voss, watching as the last remnants of the Dominion's forces scattered into the void. The war was over in all but name. "You knew they would do this," Kaler murmured. Voss didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at the shattered remains of the once mighty Zeldar fleet, his expression unreadable. "War isn't about strength," he said at last. "It's about who understands the enemy first." Kaler exhaled, feeling the weight of history shifting before his eyes. The Zorvani had fought for survival. The Zeldar had fought for conquest. But humanity had fought to win. The remnants of the Zeldar dominion crumbled like dust scattered by the wind. Once, their fleets had darkened the skies of 1,000 worlds, their banners a symbol of inevitable conquest. Now, they were little more than fractured war bands, scattered across the void, desperately clinging to the ruins of their empire. Without their command structure, without their warlords, they were nothing. Kaler stood aboard the Vorthen's Resolve, watching the star map shift as the last of the Dominion's strongholds collapsed. The Zorvani had fought for centuries, losing world after world, their people slaughtered and enslaved. But now, the war was over. The war was won. And it was not the Zorvani who had secured that victory. He turned to Colonel Elias Voss, who stood beside him, his face as impassive as ever. The human officer had barely spoken since the fall of the Devourer fleet. There was no celebration, no triumph in his stance, only a quiet certainty, the same cold efficiency with which he had conducted every battle, every operation. "It's done," Kaler murmured. Voss nodded. "Almost." Kaler frowned. "What do you mean?" "The Dominion is finished." Voss exhaled slowly. "Their empire is gone, but their species isn't. There are still survivors. Warlords who will try to rebuild, soldiers who refuse to surrender. If we leave them, they'll return." Kaler stiffened. "You would hunt them to extinction." Voss met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Would they have shown you the same mercy?" Kaler said nothing. He knew the answer. The Zeldar had never left their enemies alive to rebuild. If humanity had not entered the war, the Zorvani would have been annihilated. And yet, as he looked into Voss's eyes, he wondered if the price of victory had been too steep. The war had changed things. It had changed everything. The galaxy was no longer a battlefield between the Zorvani and the Zeldar. It belonged to humanity now. The way they fought, the way they thought. Kaler had never seen anything like it. They had not just won the war. They had reshaped its very nature. The old rules no longer applied. Across the stars, reports flooded in. Zeldar strongholds surrendering not out of necessity, but out of fear. Entire fleets laying down their arms without a fight. The demons of Earth had done more than crush the Dominion. They had broken it, and in its place, something new would rise. Kaler knew the Zorvani Senate would seek to restore their influence, to reclaim the territories they had lost. But deep down, he understood the truth. The Zorvani had not liberated themselves. They had been saved, and saviors always exacted a price. The first Terran warships entered former Dominion space within days of the final battle. They did not come as conquerors, nor as liberators. They came as something far more insidious, stabilizers. Human diplomats, backed by military fleets, moved swiftly to establish new power structures. They spoke of alliances, of peace, of rebuilding. But Taylor had seen the way their soldiers operated. There was nothing peaceful about the precision with which they secured key strategic worlds. Nothing altruistic about the way they dismantled potential threats before they could even form. It was not conquest. It was control. And the galaxy accepted it, because there was no alternative. The Zeldar were gone. The Zorvani were weak. And humanity? Humanity had proven itself to be the greatest force the stars had ever seen. In the Dominion's former capital, Voss stood before what remained of Cordatha's throne room. The High Warlord had died refusing to surrender, his final moments spent locked in battle against a force he could never have defeated. Now, the banners of the Dominion lay in tatters, their symbol trampled under human boots. Voss did not linger. There was no need. He had no interest in ruling. That was for others to decide. His war was over. But humanity's had only just begun. Across the galaxy, a new order was forming. Not through declaration, not through treaties, but through inevitability. Humanity had not seized power. They had earned it, in the only way the universe truly respected, through victory, through war. Kaler watched as the first human governors took their places in former Dominion worlds, as new alliances were forged with human oversight, as the balance of power shifted forever. He turned to Voss one last time. What happens now? The human officer looked out at the stars, his expression unreadable. Now, he said quietly. Now we build.